Welcome to another in the Classic Games series. This is my second shot at this video, and it's an important one to be sure for anybody who plays the Najdorf Sicilian. My first attempt brought the video to over an hour and a half, and I figured that was just too long. Today we're going to get a good look at a game that was played at the Interzonal in Gothenburg 1955, and this was in round 14. It has become known as the Argentine Tragedy. And the reason for this is that in this round, the luck of the draw pitted 4 Soviet players playing white against the 4 Argentinians, and 3 of the games followed the same course, which are the ones we're going to look at. Our main game will be Geller versus Panno, and then Spassky versus Pilnik, and Keres versus Najdorf will be covered in the notes of the game. The story of the Argentine Tragedy has been told in books, for example, Yakov Damsky's chess records, and it's even got prominent mention in Garry Kasparov's wonderful DVD on the Najdorf Variation. The fact that the Soviets were able to pull off a hat trick in the same variation with the same opening novelty is indeed a triumph, but that's only part of the story. The variation played was the Najdorf Variation 6 Bishop G5 by white. It's a very sharp line. Normally, and this is a line where the innovation that the Argentinians came up with was to play H6, and we'll see that very soon. But normally the move H6 can be a great cause of alarm for black because white would like to get in the move G2 to G4 and G5. And with a pawn on H6, obviously you're going to be heading into a quick attack there. But the Argentinians came up with a plan to counteract that, which was very ingenious, actually. So this happened because earlier they were having a hard time with the Najdorf, and they got together and came up with this novelty, which is pretty neat to come up with something new in an opening while you're sitting there at the tournament. The Najdorf is a counterattack more than it is a defense, in my opinion. It is an opening that walks the razor's edge well into the middle game. Sacrifices are very common for both sides, and computer analysis often proves futile, as many of the sacrifices will not be justified for many, many moves. Computers have the well-known horizon effect, in other words, where their computer is limited to so many plies or so many half moves, and then it can't see any further. Well, in the Najdorf, these variations get to be so long from the sacrifices that I call this an out-of-the-orbit effect rather than a horizon effect. And this is particularly true of the 6 Bishop G5 line with the Najdorf in many different variations, and also, most importantly, I should say, the poison pawn variation. As a matter of fact, John Nunn even said it was pointless to try and analyze the poison pawn with the computer. I think even, that was written, about 8 years ago that I read that, and even now, I don't think computers have made far enough advances to really say that the poison pawn is a win for white or black. New things pop up, as we saw in Zibit's video of Svedler versus, Wang Hao, and that was the Russian Cup, I believe. And Shirov's novelty in that one came at move 22 with queen to f4, which actually, I will do a video on that as soon as I get a chance, was not the best move. He won on the move after it because of his opponent's mistake. That's just the kind of opening that this is. The Najdorf is just right on the razor's edge from beginning to end. I hope the viewers will forgive me for not giving a full bio of all the players. Our main game, as I said, will be Geller versus Panno, and in the commentary we'll be covering Spassky versus Pilnik and Keres versus Najdorf. To save time, I will point out the improvement that Bobby Fischer made 3 years later in 1958 that he came up with black pieces. If time permits, I'll post a follow-up video, or I might even tag it on to the end of this if this is shorter than I'm hoping it to be. Okay, with that, let's move on to the game. Okay, I apologize for that. I said Svedler there in the introduction about the poison pawn, but I corrected myself and caught it with saying Shirov later on. Anyway, we're going to be looking at this game, the Argentine Tragedy. And we're just going to look at it from the light pieces, so I play it from both sides. I'm not going to be terribly concerned about move orders or even certain variations, but I do want to point out that this move, a6, brings about the Najdorf. And there's a lot of alternatives here that white could play. You could play bishop e2. Usually don't want to play bishop e3 unless you have the bishop on e2, keeping the knight from coming to g4. But it has been played lots of time of bishop e3, knight g4, bishop g5, h6, bishop h4, and that gets into a whole bunch of complicated stuff. It's a very positional game, but if white keeps his head, he's going to hold a fairly decent advantage out of it. But my favorite move, and the move played in this game, is 6 bishop g5. Now John Nunn has a book on this. It is called The Complete Najdorf 6 bishop g5. And he says it's a definitive guide to Fischer and Kasparov's favorite opening. And it is very sharp. And again, we're going to go with main continuation, which is e6. There are options there for black, but now white plays f4. And this move is just saying to black, I'm coming after your king. Queen to b6 can be played here, and that would go into the poison pawn variation. And hopefully I'll get another video on that fairly soon. But in this game, played bishop e7, queen f3, and now the most common move by far is queen c7. But here the Argentinians had an idea. And h6 had been played before, but not with the follow-up that they came up with. They had played h6 before in the tournament and were not having a good time with it. But we'll see that they found an improvement. Bishop h4 was played, and now g5. They whip out their improvement. This move has two distinct ideas. First of all, white would love to play g2 to g4 and then g4 to g5. But now there's a pawn on that square. So you can't do that. And if f takes g5, which I think white should take it, I can't see any good alternative, knight f d7. Now, first of all, I want to point out all these highlighted squares here, the b5 square, d4 and d5, f5, e6, f7, are all targets for white. Not that they're weak, but they're all squares that are prone to sacrifices of different types happening. And you must bear in mind that in a lot of lines of the Sicilian, for white to maintain an advantage, he is required to sacrifice in a lot of these. So it takes a sharp eye to play this opening with the white pieces, but it is very aggressive. And it's hard to, like I said in the intro, to get a computer to help you with the analysis to nail it down to be absolutely perfect for one side or the other. So imagine this, all 4 boards, and 3 of the boards are playing the same opening. They're all sitting near each other where they can see each other's games. And black just played knight f d7. Well, first of all, the idea is that this pawn can't be taken because this bishop's pinned. Alright, so that's not playable. The other point is that this knight wants to come into here and would like to have this guy come in here to back him up. Okay, that seems like a good plan, because if this knight can get here, then it's guarding this square and this square, and if anything takes it, it's going to be recaptured by the other knight. That's the basic premise of the Argentinians' novelty. So imagine them all sitting there staring at this novelty. I imagine that Geller, well, it could have been any of them, but I think, what if Geller saw, well, the only way to keep the advantage here is to sacrifice. And that's what he did. And he played knight takes e6. Now I imagine the other two players, whoever they were, for white, just decided to sit back and see how this sacrifice carried out. I would like to point out that the alternative of queen to h5 is just too slow, because black's going to play knight to e5. His bishop's protecting the e6 square, so the other knight can freely come to c6 and bolster the knight on e5. So Geller played knight takes e6. And the nice thing about playing the same opening is you can wait out another person's game and see how it's going, and if it's going good, then you can follow suit. And here, black played f takes e6, which I think is the right move. Just want to point out, knight takes e5 leaves black in a long, struggling disadvantage after knight takes d8, knight takes f3, g takes f3, and now if bishop takes d8, knight to d5 holds the advantage for white. For example, if he takes here, we could, if we'd like, just take here, because if he takes, then we go check, and we pick up the rook and come slipping out this way. And king takes d8. Now if knight to d5 here, h takes g5 and bishop f2 is pretty much the same as bishop f2 straight away, h g5 and bishop b6 check. And now the thing is, white's up a pawn, black's got some weak pawns, both have their bishop pairs. This is, to me, is largely in favor of white. It should be, I consider it a one game for white. Alright, so after knight takes e6, black recaptured. And now queen to h5 check and king to f8. Alright, so just a couple moves in this combination, and these were forced. Black would now like to get his knight to e5. And again, let me explain that goal for him. He'd like to play this knight to here and this other knight to here, and then it guards the g6 and f7 square. So though black's king is exposed, there's no real inroads for white to get at the king. And we'll see that the Soviets combat this with a really nice move on their own part, and they don't want black continuing with that plan. Well, first let's look at some alternatives. Let's look at bishop c4, which seems like a natural development move. It's hitting the e pawn, but with knight to e5, the e pawn is protected by the bishop now, and after castles, king to g7, and then bishop g3 hitting the knight. Knight b to c6 defends the knight, and again we got the desirable position of the knights. Knight on e5 is holding everything together for black. As a matter of fact, if black is able to establish this position of the knights, then I would have more fear for the white king than the black king, because after h takes g5, then the rook is hitting down on an open file. He could maybe lift the rook up on the h file, bring the queen to h8, play d5, bishop to c5 check, force the king into a corner, and then some kind of sacrifices in the offing. So if black is able to get this position, then I think black's going to win, actually. In the long run, I think he'll win. Okay, let's go back and say that bishop c4 is not the best move for white. Another idea might be bishop g3, like a preemptive strike on the e5 square. Now, knight c6 be similar to what the game line would be, and I don't want to go into that too much, but it's a better version. It's a better version for black than the main line. King g7, queen g4 seems to be the white's best shot. H takes g5, and now if queen takes e6, then knight c5, queen d5, bishop e6, queen d4, and play is a bit unclear, but I think I'd rather have the black pieces here. Black is, for 2 pawns, he's got a piece. He's pretty much created a little cocoon around his king. Though it looks airy, there's no way for white to get to it right away. After h takes g5, white should probably castle, but still, after knight c6, we're ready to throw that other knight on e5 now. Queen takes e6. Again, knight c5, queen d5, and bishop e6. And again, white's got to prove his sacrifice is sound. He's only got 2 pawns for the piece, and we're starting to get into positions where the pieces are more important than the pawns. Black's pieces are getting well developed, and actually they're aiming toward the queen side in some ways. So I'd rather be black here again. So instead of bishop g3, the players thought for a while and thought for a while and said, okay, I know what they want. They want to bring this other knight to c6 and then one of the knights up to e5. And Geller now played bishop b5. Very sharp move, and I think I'd choose this move knowing the theory now. Bishop g3 is okay, but this is the best shot because it complicates things. It keeps it sharp. Bishop g3 is, unclear, as we just saw. So bishop b5, though, is a horse of a different color here. What can I say? If he takes it, if he takes the bishop, then I think after castles, bishop f6, gf6, black gets in knight e5, but I'm not sure. I'd have to call it unclear, and so maybe taking the bishop deserves more analysis, but I think that I would rather play the white pieces here, because maybe after bishop g3, certainly knight bd7 could be played, but I think white keeps pressuring up. And I like white here. Black's got some problems, some real organic problems with his development. White's got some open lines, or come to here and here. If this is gone, he's aiming for that. He's aiming for this. He's also got this under attack. Yeah, of course, black would probably play this to stop the attack on the b pawn. King h1 seems obvious, and then, I don't know, maybe b4. Maybe white could try something like this, threatening this. There's a lot of attacking ideas for white, so I'd rather have white. But can black hold it? I don't know. Needs some detailed work and some good analysis. The move played by the Argentinians was, Geller played knight e5, which leads to a sharp game. The other two played king to g7, and they lost, though maybe a better fight could have been put up. And then Bobby Fischer, 3 years later, found rook to h7. And when I was looking at these games before I did any analysis, I was unaware of the Fischer game, and I thought rook h7 looked pretty natural to me too. But the variations are quite in depth and they're detailed, so right now I'm not going to present this. But instead we're going to look at what the 2 other Argentinian players played, king to g7. Now both games followed the same course for several moves. Castled, he's threatening mate on f7. Knight to e5 stops the mate. Bishop g3 threatens to remove the knight and then to mate on f7 again. Knight to g6. G takes h6. Rook takes h6. Now rook to f7 check. Very sharp play by the Soviets. King takes f7. Queen takes h6. And now to give you an idea of the problems with the computer analysis, I have Fritz 11 saying it's close to equal, slightly in favor for black, and Deep Junior is saying a little over half a pawn advantage for white. You can't make a decision of the value, assess the value of the position in a line like this. A takes b5, rook to f1 check, king to e8, queen takes g6 check, king d7. So I can only assume that these two boards are right next to each other. And now rook to f7. Actually, that may not have been best. Probably rook to d1 was best. Rook to f7, knight c6, knight to d5. Another sack is offered. And now both Argentinians played rook to a2. Rook takes a2. Well, let's look at what happens if he takes the sack. Now, instead of pawn takes pawn, we go queen takes d6, a very important intermezzo. Because after king to e8, queen to g6. Now we're threatening all sorts of discovered checks. So, if he tries king to d7, then e takes d5. If knight a5, d6, same with knight to b4. So rook a6 and d6 still comes. And this is a decisive advantage for white. So king d7 does not work. Queen to b6 is worth a try. It's with check. Bishop f2. Queen a6. Now rook f5. And here's the fault of playing e takes d5. Because now after king to d8, we got rook takes d5 check. And I don't see how black's going to survive this. Okay, so e takes d5 doesn't really work. Both the Argentinians played rook takes a2. And now here we have a parting of the ways between the two players. The first game we're going to look at is h3, which is the move that Spassky played. And this shows some deep thought, and it's actually very interesting that if we were to play these games now spread out over a different time, it would make sense that the theory would evolve that this is the better move based on the variations we're going to look at. And let's get into that. Now e takes d5 is met by the very same thing. Queen takes d6, king e8, queen g6, king d7, e takes d5. It's a little bit different. Queen b6, king h2, queen c5, trying to stop the d6 move. But now we just take the knight. B takes c6, and now rook f3. The idea is to come to d3 and continue the attack. Black wants to block on d4. Now c3 is renewing the threat of rook d3 check, and I don't see how he can stop it. So white's clearly winning here. And again, he's down in material. He's a piece for 2 pawns down. And he doesn't even have, I don't believe he's going to even have to worry about promoting his h-pawn. I don't think it's going to get that far. What the Argentinians played here is queen to h8. And one played it and then the other felt, hey, that's a good idea. It's not. The best move, I felt, was rook takes b2. Now, both the players were up to the same point here, and they both played queen to h8. And the difference here in Spassky's variation with the pawn on h3 comes evident after knight takes e7, knight takes e7, and now bishop to h4. And this is why Spassky didn't move his pawn to h4. Because if we look at the Keres game, we see that with the pawn on h4, the bishop can't come to that square to pressure that knight. So white's only hope is to put pressure on the knight by queen to g5, but we see there that the rook is protecting the b pawn. I actually consider this position dynamically equal. I think black can work his way out of it. Yeah, the h-pawn is going to be some kind of threat to contend with, but I think that black's going to be able to stir up some counterplay before that pawn gets to be too much of a threat. So that was in the Keres game. Let's go back just real quickly to the Spassky game where he had played h3, so the bishop can come to h4 here. That's this move. And now king c6, rook takes e7. Material is dead equal. Well, actually black's up a pawn, but I'd still have to say white has the advantage. Yeah, maybe not too much. It ranges from, again, from my computers, it says from a half a point to 1.5 points. Well, 1.4 points for white. I'm not so certain. I don't know if black can hold this. Certainly, if white makes a mistake, then black can hold it if white error is on his way. But, so, rook takes b2 should have probably been tried, even in this h3 line. Playing the game actually continued with queen h8, and this is very bad, because after knight takes e7, knight takes e7, queen to g5, rook to a1 check, king to h2, queen to d8. The queen had to come back anyhow. Queen takes b5 check. So if that rook had been on b2, that move's not there. King to c7, queen to c5 check, taking advantage of the pin. King to b8, bishop takes pawn check, king to a8, and we take the knight. And after rook a5 and queen to b4, black resigned, Pilnik resigned. Nice game by Spassky. And that was after h3. Let's look at h4. Okay, after the move h4, again, rook takes b2 was called for, but queen to h8 was played. Monkey see, monkey do, and perhaps Najdorf felt that his countryman was onto something, but again, this is pulling the queen away needlessly. And after knight takes e7, knight takes e7, queen to g5. I guess Najdorf was watching the Pilnik game and decided, you know what, it's lost, I'm not even going to try. And he shook Keres' hand and gave up the point. But let's get back to the Geller-Panno game. And I like to believe that here Panno probably stalled for time and watched his countrymen go down in flames, and that's why he chose, whoops, sorry, I am in a side variation here, my fault. Yeah, here we go. I think that Panno may have saw how his countrymen were going and thought that he had a better idea with knight to e5 here. And now after, well, castles, king to g8 and rook f6, the sequencing of the moves here is important. If white tries to revert to the classic adventure of the Gothenburg variation with bishop g3 in this, he gets badly mistreated after h6, g5. Now two pieces are hanging. Queen to e8 solves that problem, but queen takes, bishop takes, now knight bc6, and those knights are fortified in the center, and I think black has a very desirable game here. And he's also only given up one pawn for the piece at this point. So if he goes rook to f6, and this was played in the game Satelovskaya versus Nedeljikovich. Boy, those are tough names. This is Belgrade 1961. And that game continued with bishop takes f6, gf6, and now king h7. Queen f8 is playable, I believe, that after bishop a4, bishop d7, rook f1, queen f7, this looks pretty good for black. So, after g takes f6, king h7, bishop g5, queen f8, bishop d3. Another nice thing about the knight on e5 is it stops the e pawn of white from moving and denies white's king bishop from getting into the game from the d3 square. Rook g8, h4, knight b c6, rook f1. Now this is a side game, so we're not giving it too much attention here. It's just a continuing progression of the theory of this opening. Now rook g6, and so far it's black has a rook and a knight versus a bishop and 2 pawns, and I don't see a point in really continuing this out because black has solidified his defenses on the king side. He's got a material advantage. I think black's going to win. That was after castles check immediately. Geller played bishop g3, which I think is the correct way to continue the attack. Now if bishop takes g5, castles. If king to g8, then we get bishop takes e5, and we're threatening mate, and we're threatening rook on h8. If king g7, same thing, bishop takes e5. So king e7 has to be tried. And now after bishop takes e5, if black tries to swing his bishop around for the defense, such as this, with bishop e3 check, king h1, d takes e5, with the idea that if queen takes e5, bishop d4 will hold, then well, this doesn't quite hold because of this nice little move, knight d5. And as I said, when you're playing the Sicilian, you gotta always look out for sacrifices. Look how long this bishop's been sitting here on b5, and now white throws his knight on d5. It can't be taken by the pawn because it's pinned, but it does force black to play queen takes d5. And now after queen takes c7, the queen is hanging, and if he interposes, he'll still lose the queen. Nothing he can do about it. Black is lost. So bishop e3, trying to swing the bishop around, doesn't work. Queen to b6 was played by Panno, and after king h1, d takes e5 was played. Let's just quickly look at, if he finally takes the bishop on b5, that doesn't work out, because if bishop takes h8, king to d8, rook a to d1, b4, bishop to d4, queen to c6, and now bishop to e5, and white's attack is just going to crash through. Alright, king to h1, and now d takes e5. Queen f7 makes sense. King to e6, rook a d1, and you can tell that Panno must not have been a happy camper at this point. Queen to d4, rook takes d4, e takes d4, e5. This is just real ugly. Now, if king takes e5, queen to c7 is mate. So that's why he played e5, adds another piece and cuts off an escape square. Now, king to c5, queen to c7 check, knight c6, bishop c6, and Panno resigned at this point because Geller, if he was allowed to play on, say after d takes c3, bishop b7 check, and now king d4, queen c3 is mate, king b5, it just takes a bit longer, queen c6, king a5, queen c5, king a4, and then b3 would be checkmate. So there you have the Argentine tragedy. Interesting idea by black, you know. He wants this strong point to e4 square. But white's move, bishop b5, dashes that plan altogether. Okay, so judging from what I can guess so far is the video is around 35 minutes long, so maybe I do have time to give Fischer's treatise of this. So it's a new day. It's 1961, or 1958, I'm sorry, 3 years later, and Fischer comes up with rook to h7. Now, in the complete Najdorf by none, he gives this move an exclamation mark to White's bishop b5 move, and I think that maybe rook h7 might take that exclamation mark away, although objectively it's the best move. Rook h7. There's a couple ways to handle this. Gligerich played queen g6, and after rook f7, queen takes h6, king g8, queen g6. Well, bishop takes d7 was played by Kupka versus Jansa in 1960, a couple years after this. Bishop takes d7, e5, d5, castles, rook h7, queen g6 check, rook g7, queen to d3, and Jansa playing black went on to win this. And we can see that White's got a full 3 pawns for the piece, but he can't get at black's king now. For some reason, actually he's only got 2 pawns because they're followed bishop takes pawn check, bishop takes, queen takes check, king to b1, and after knight c6, we can see that black's going to get his other rook into the game. He's going to consolidate. Yeah, he's got a bad bishop, but it is a bishop and not pawn, so it's going to eventually get more mobility. Also, how does White hold on to the e5 pawn? He can't. So after g3, knight takes e5. Now White's only got 1 pawn for the piece, and that's definitely not enough. Okay, so enough of that. Back to the Fischer game. King g8, queen g6 check, rook g7, queen takes e6, king h8, bishop takes d7, knight takes d7, and now White's got 4 pawns, at least temporarily, for the piece. Castles, knight e5, queen to d5, now bishop to g4. Isn't that just like Fischer? I mean, he could play bishop takes g5 right away, but he does this first, rook df1, and now he takes the pawn, and king to b1. Now White's got 3 pawns for the piece. Fischer plays queen to e7, queen to d2, bishop e6, g3, and this is, I wanted to show you this because this is very typical of Fischer's play. And okay, look at his king. It's wide open, wide exposed, but all his pieces around it. And White really has no way of getting at it. White wants to double his rooks. He goes rook f4, queen to g5, queen to f2, king to g8, rook to e1, rook to f7. Trades would certainly favor black. b3, queen to e7, queen to d4. And now, one of the reasons I wanted to show this game is I was wondering here, did Fischer miss a chance for a win? What do you think? I'll show you the move I'm thinking of and let you pause the video and look and see if you agree. Does knight f3 give black a decisive edge? Well, look, it's forking the queen and the rook, and the rook on f7 indirectly protects it. Now, I figure best play for White is to take the rook, bishop takes, now knight d5, threatens the queen, and it's a strong move. I don't think taking the queen on d4 is any good. And then I think queen e5 has to be played. I think queen f8 is just asking for it after queen to d1. Now the point is if he takes the rook, then we've got queen to g4, queen g7, and queen to h4. We're hitting the rook on d8 now. And what choices does this rook have for a move? If he goes rook f8, then knight to e7's mate on the spot. But if he goes to e8, then there's knight f6, and king f8, knight h7 check, and I think White's going to get a perp out of this. Same with rook to c8, knight to e7. Or we could even go with, let's go to b8 just to explain this. knight f6. He could have gone f6 with the rook on c8 as well. And there's an odd kind of perpetual here, because if he goes to e8, we can just go back to f6 and check again. And okay, let's look at it this way: king e8, knight f6, and now king e7. He has to go back to f8, because if he goes to d8 or e7, then there's knight h5, and I believe white's going to win this now. Okay, so after white plays knight d5, I think black has to play queen to e5. Then queen takes, pawn takes, and now the rook can move. If rook e2, then bishop takes d5, e d5, rook takes d5, and I think that black has very good winning chances in this. And if rook to e3, then simply knight h2, and again, I think I'd rather have the black pieces here. He's going to be able to trade on d5 if he doesn't move the knight. You know, it's a lot of bad things can happen. So, let's see, where was that move? Knight f3. Yeah, here. So that was the question. Did knight f3 give black good winning chances? Now, from my analysis, it looks like it did. Fischer played knight to g6 here. And after rook takes f7, queen takes f7, queen to e3, the players agreed to a draw here. There are quite a few other games with this rook f7 or rook h7 move, and maybe this will breathe life back into this variation. One of the interesting things I found in closing this out about the Najdorf variation is that a lot of these lines that were played back in the 60s and early 70s can be gone through, and you can look for it now with the aid of computers and going through the existing games that you knew from back then or that are available from back then, and using the computer, you can come up with some novelties or some refinements at least that would prove one side or the other can hold the position better than they used to in the past. There's a line that I play in the regular Najdorf with 6 bishop g5 as white that seems like a tempo waster, but it has a very important aspect behind it. And in one of the future videos, I hope to present that from one of my own games. It was played, actually I think Spassky had played it against, I can't remember who he played it against, but it's an old line, and modern theory says it's not good, but with a little bit of tweaking, help of a computer and a good book like Nunn's The Complete Najdorf, Bishop g5, you know, you can, as a amateur player, you can come up with some ideas of your own, well, not your own, I mean using the computer and using the printed information that you got. You can come up with ideas that can give you a very playable game. Alright, that is it for the Argentine Tragedy and Fischer's improvement. I hope you found this video interesting and informative. And until next time, wish you good luck and good